Hi, everybody. My name is Lisa Bleich, and I am not only the chair of the One Jewish Community Book Read, but I also have the distinct pleasure of being the JCC's in-house author moderator. Before we begin, just some Zoom housekeeping. We will be recording everybody this event tonight. We'll also have everybody on mute so that we don't have any ambient noises. We do recommend or encourage you to put questions in the chat box when we get to the Q&A part of our event. We'll also put links to purchase copies of the trade-off in the chat, and also we'll send it to you. Karen will send it to you via email. So I am very excited this evening to introduce and welcome back to our community, Samantha Sam Greene Woodruff. A few years ago, we were lucky enough to have her here to talk about her debut novel, The Lobotomist's Wife, which won all sorts of awards and became an Amazon #1 bestseller. And I thoroughly enjoyed the book, so hopefully you guys did as well. We had a great conversation a couple years back. And those of you who are not familiar with Sam, I want to tell you a little bit about her. Samantha Sam Greene Woodruff is an accomplished author known for her historical novels that delve into complex societal themes. Sam has a BA in history from Wesleyan University and an MBA from NYU Stern School of Business. She spent most of her career telling stories to executives at MTV Networks as a senior vice president of strategy and business development, and subsequently audience research for the Nickelodeon Kids and Family Group. After leaving the corporate life, she pursued various passions, including teaching yoga, cooking, and taking classes at the Writing Institute at Sarah Lawrence College. It was there that she combined her multifaceted background with her wild imagination and passion for history, reading, and writing. Sam lives in Southern Connecticut with her husband, 2 children, and 2 dogs, and The Trade-Off is her second novel. So welcome, Sam. We're so thrilled to have you with us
Thank
tonight.
you. I'm so happy to be here.
Yeah, yeah.
Thank you to
Uh,
everyone who's tuning in.
Yes, yes, to all of our listeners. Before we get into too many details of the books, the trade-off, I'm just going to hold it up for those of you who have not yet had a chance to read it. If you could just give us a little bit of an overview of the book and what the story's about so that everybody's on the same page.
Sure. So the trade-off takes place in Manhattan in the 1920s, and it's the story of a young Jewish woman, first generation American born, who is a twin. Her name is Bee Abramowitz, and her parents fled the pogroms in the early 1900s and came to America. And her mother, in particular, lost everything. She was extraordinarily wealthy in Russia and lost everything coming over. And so the family has a bit of a preoccupation with regaining wealth and money because their mother never got over the loss. Bee is whip smart, very plucky, and has an uncanny ability with numbers and pattern recognition. And she has a really unusual dream, which is to become a stockbroker on Wall Street. Because she loves the patterns and she's really good at predicting stock movements. Unfortunately, what she doesn't realize, she knows there aren't many women on Wall Street, but she doesn't know that not only does she have a strike against her for being female, but she also has a strike against her for being poor and another one for being Jewish. So with her twin brother in tow, she hatches some schemes to get involved in the market anyway. And as the decade goes on, they really take advantage of the boom of the 1920s, but she sees the crash coming, and it is the only one. And so at the end of the story, there's a bit of a Chicken Little thing going on where she's saying a crash is coming, and she can't seem to get anybody to listen. So
The ultimate
read
gaslighting.
it if you haven't to find out if she actually
Yeah.
convinces anybody or what happens.
Exactly. So what got you interested in this topic? I know you have an MBA from Stern, but were you in, it doesn't sound like you were in finance. So how did you get interested in this particular topic?
I've always thought the stock market was intensely boring, and I'm married to an investor. We
Okay.
met in business school, but in early 2021, there was an event in the contemporary market called it was called the GameStop short squeeze. It was about the company GameStop, and it basically what happened, for those of you who aren't familiar with it, is that a very prominent hedge fund investor had shorted the stock, which basically means he bet, if you haven't read my book, I'll explain. He bet that the stock price was too high and that it was going to go down.
Mhm.
And it just happened to be this magic moment where a lot of average everyday people were home still furloughed because it was still during the pandemic, the height of the pandemic, and they were doing day trading and they banded together on Reddit and were led by a guy who was like a Pied Piper for all of them. And they were able to invest through these online easy investment things and decided that he was wrong. This hedge fund guy was wrong about GameStop and they were going to drive the price of the stock up and screw him. And it was it was twofold. It was a two-pronged attack. On the one hand, they thought he was wrong, and so they were trying to make money, right, just like anyone who was investing in the market. But also this became this David and Goliath battle where the everyman home investor was going to take down the bad hedge fund guy. And it got so personal that there were memes and other, items in the news every single day deriding him. And he's personally started to receive death threats.
Oh my goodness.
And it just so happens, I don't think I would have paid any attention to this except for the fact that it really was front page news for several days, like all the time. But it so happens that hedge fund guy was in my wedding. He's one of my husband's best work friends.
Wow.
And I suddenly said, it crystallized this idea for me that that there's this very black and white thinking, particularly around money, around wealth in general, but particularly when it comes to finance and the markets. And there's an assumption that if you are a professional investor and you're making tons of money, you are inherently greedy and bad and a little bit evil and a little this kind of person. And if you are a regular person and you happen to manage to make money doing the same thing, you're inherently good. And I said to my husband, this is so oversimplified. Like there's so much gray area that is not explored here. I wish I could write about this, but I write historical fiction. And I do not want to write a contemporary book about a hedge fund guy. And he said, well, there was this guy in the 1920s who shorted the crash. His name was Jesse Livermore, and he made a fortune. And I looked at him and I said, there was short selling in the 1920s. I had no idea. And so I started to research Livermore, and that was where the idea began. What I discovered as I researched Livermore was that he was really an awful guy. He wasn't necessarily always an awful guy, but he was a self-made man. He started off like working on the streets and as a panhandler, but like he was
right, working on the Wall Street, right?
He worked on the streets in Wall Street with like the chop shops and like the worst, they called them bucket shops, in the worst places, and slowly made his way through and developed a really unique investment strategy that was very data driven and much more so than what most people were doing at the time. But Wall Street was entirely unregulated until the crash. And once he became a person of a certain echelon with a certain amount of wealth, he became part of the small cadre of men who colluded to make the market do whatever they wanted it to do. And so there was this other layer in the market in those days that I knew nothing about because I think the market is boring fundamentally.
But not according to your book. It was actually
not
quite interesting.
I found a way for it to be interesting. But It is amazing to think that when we think about Wall Street and investing, even though I think people do think that the fat cats are still around and being exploitative, compared to what it was like before before regulation and before the SEC and before the FDIC and all these things, that you can't compare it. It was the Wild West, and the big guys were the winners, no matter what. And Livermore was one of them. So I didn't want to write about him in the end.
Right. Yes. Okay. So how did that research inform and develop B? Like, B, who's the quintessential opposite of Livermore, right?
Yes. So my first book was The Lobotomist's Wife. And when I started and I had Livermore, I was like, I'm going to write The Stockbroker's Wife. Somehow it's going to be Livermore's wife who convinces him to short sell the market or something like that. And I don't know if
Yeah.
anyone here or you, Lisa, have read the book Trust by Hernan Diaz, but
I haven't
it
read it, but I will. It's
it it,
good.
it's very dense. I
Okay.
say the trade-off is like the book club version of Trust by Hernan Diaz.
That's
There's
more my speak. Yeah.
similarly like a rich investor who profits from the market, and his wife is very
Mhm.
prominent in the story. But once I saw who Livermore was, I didn't want to write about his wife. I like to write about strong women. I sort of want a female protagonist if I can have one. And so I said, wow, it would make my short seller so much more empathetic and interesting if she was a
Mhm.
woman. And so that was my first seed. And then I wanted her to have a reason to be interested in the markets and a reason to want to get wealthy that was not simply greed and money grubbing.
Right.
And so then I looked to my own family story because it just so happens that my grandmother's mother, my great grandmother, fled early pogroms and came to America from Russia, Poland, wherever the borders were at that
Right.
time, and lost everything and had been incredibly
Oh
wealthy.
wow.
And she had four children, three boys and a girl. My grandma was the girl, and the boys were little princes, and my grandma was her servant. And so I said, this is such a perfect setup to have these like immigrants chasing the American dream and a woman who wants to make her way. And the 1920s was such a liberated time for women in so many ways that I actually thought a woman could maybe make her way on Wall Street back then.
Right.
And
It's so funny
then,
that,
yeah, go
oh,
ahead.
go ahead.
No,
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 I was
I
just saying
can
it's so
talk for an
funny that you
hour.
say that about your grandma because my grandma, my dad's mom, she came from Russia also. I don't know if it was during, I don't think it was because of the Bekrams. It was like earlier in the 1900s. But also like there was one grandson, my older brother, and then all the others were girls, and he was the prince. He could do no wrong. No matter what he did,
Right.
he was the best. So I don't know if it was something about that era or if it was just something about that
I
mindset, but
think,
it was
yes, no, I think it was, I think that's the way things were then. And I've had people comment, if you have read the book, about Bee's twin brother, because she's treated much as the servant.
yeah,
She takes care of everybody and he gets to skate by. And everyone says,
right.
how could you write such a dysfunctional relationship and a codependent relationship and it's toxic and he's awful? And I sort of said, my thinking is, this is very typical of what it would have been
Yeah,
like in certainly like an immigrant Jewish family in this
right.
era. Like the men
Right.
were, the men
The
got to
men were
stand
at
for
the
the,
top. The men were,
yeah,
no matter what they did, no
yes,
matter how, whatever they did,
yes,
they were always on the pedestal.
yes.
It's interesting also just how the characters were so young and yet made so much money so quickly. I mean, when I think about them, they were in their early 20s, right? And so my kids are all in their 20s right now. So what was it about that era that allowed them to advance so quickly?
So the thing about the 1920s, which I mean, when I think of the 20s, I think of the Great Gatsby, right? I
Mhm.
think of flappers and speakeasies and extreme wealth and big parties and all that. And I threw a lot of that stuff into the book, and that all is part of it. But what I didn't realize until I really got into the research for this book is that, first of all, the stock market was on a tear. So people could make unbelievable amounts of money incredibly
Mhm.
quickly. And the economy was exploding. So it was this very, very prosperous time in the country. And
Mhm.
everybody was making money in a million different ways. There were all sorts of like movies were growing and movie studios were a whole new area. There were all these new areas. There was Westinghouse and there was electric and there was radio, and there were just, it was a really fertile time in the country.
Right.
And so people in their 20s were legitimate adults that were working
Yep.
and making money. Much
Yeah.
more than the people in their 20s are now.
Yeah, this is true. It's right. They're not. They're still at home, but they're.
Right.
Not, I mean, they were still at home back then, but not in the same way.
Exactly.
Let's talk a little bit about like. So you talked about Jess Livermore was true. You also that there was that Justin Oil Ponzi scheme. I know you have a presentation. Do you want to maybe just share with our listeners?
So I can just give you guys a quick, just a view of, before I go to the screen, what I'll say is that I think any reader of historical fiction, and I'm a reader of historical fiction in addition to writing historical fiction, I think comes to historical fiction to feel like they're immersed in the world and to feel like they're learning something. And so you need to build a trust with the reader about what it is, about the world that they're in. So I
Sure.
really do a lot of careful research to make sure things are accurate. And wherever I can, I will insert real places and people.
Yeah.
And, like for instance, and this isn't in there's a scene where Bee and her boyfriend Nate go skating,
Hmm.
and I like that there wasn't a true skating pond. It was a pond. It wasn't like a rink yet. And, and I
Okay.
wanted to, you want to make sure those things are right. Fiona Davis is all about this um, with her books about places. So, okay. So how do let's see, share screen. I can share my screen. You guys are going to see
Yeah.
everything that I have here, but so
You could
let's see
just
if
pick the one screen that you want to
I
share.
know. I'm gonna share this one, and then I have to put it into slideshow. Hold on. Okay, now everybody can see this.
Yeah.
So this is this is a map, and oh, you can see me on the side. I can show you guys the actual map. This was a map that I found, an illustrated map of Manhattan in 1926. Can you see it? It's huge.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
And I'm just showing it so you can see like the highlighted area up in the corner that it says the ghetto. Like that's what they called the area where the Jews lived, the Lower East Side, where that was predominantly Jewish, was the ghetto. So if you look, I don't know, can you see my cursor on the like circling? It's like the red square area, but then I
Yeah.
make that
Red
bigger
square.
on the upper right corner.
Oh, yes. Yes.
So just to give you a sense of like this was how things were mapped out, but this was also sort of what the areas were called. You had the ghetto, you had the Italian quarter, you had the different bridges, and I just love that the Francis Tavern, which was one of the earliest food and drink establishments in the city. So I think it's just fun to see this because it gives you a sense of, it makes it feel much more intimate. So that's the first picture I have. Next, this is what Orchard Street looked like in the 1920s. And so for those of you who have not read the book, Bee's father is a fruit and vegetable peddler with a push cart on Orchard Street when in the early part of the book. So this was Orchard Street. I'm sure many of you have seen pictures like this before. Bee goes to work at what's now JP Morgan or JP Morgan Chase, but is called the House of Morgan back in the day. And this is what it looked like back then. And you can see the bottom picture of the inside lobby with this wood coffered ceiling and marble inlaid floors. And it was really just a dramatic building. And it was the center of it all. It was at the intersection of Broad and Wall Street and at 23 Wall Street. And where the intersection was called the corner. So that I have all of that in the book. This is Black Tuesday when the market crashed. You can see how crowded it was and how many people were in line to try and get in to do trades and make things happen, which was impossible because it was just all happening too fast. This is inside the stock exchange on that day, but I think the stock exchange probably looked like this quite frequently, but this was really a crazy day. So then in the book, they go to some like real Manhattan places. One is Chumley's Speakeasy, and unfortunately they had a fire, so I couldn't get pictures of real pictures from before the fire. But you see in the bottom over here, it says the Dylan Thomas Fund. The Chumley's is down in the West Village and was still, I mean, when I was in my 20s, it was still like a place people loved to go because artists and poets and everybody mingled at Chumley's. So, and you can see the pictures from the street of the two exits. If there was a raid, this is like just a fun fact. If there was a raid, there was an exit on the other side at 86 Barrow Street, and they believe that the origin of the term to 86 something, like quickly get rid of it, what came from leaving Chumley's through the 86 Barrow door.
Oh, just
Yeah, right. This is Adolph Asti's restaurant, which I did not know existed until I started looking for a place for Bee and her boyfriend Nate to go on a date. And it was this restaurant where opera singers frequented, and many of the waiters and waiters, not waitresses at the time, were opera singers or aspiring opera singers, and so they would break out into song and sing arias all through dinner. So I love seeing that. They also go to the Cotton Club, and this is the original Cotton Club. The thing about the Cotton Club that was so shocking was that the crowd was all white, even though it was up in Harlem, and it was often Duke Ellington's band. So I loved that idea of that juxtaposition, and so I had them go there. And then Jesse Livermore, who I talked about, this was his
Right.
Gatsby-like home on Long Island. Um, Very much like the Great Gatsby in that same area,
Right.
East Egg, West Egg, sort of all the that part of Long Island. Just to give you a sense of, like, if you didn't know what those mansions looked like, this is a real one. And that's it. That is the end of this slideshow. Just a quick one.
Very cool.
Pictures and
Very cool to
places.
kind of put it all together. Um,
Yes.
I think you alluded to, well, first of all, Bonnie said that her parents had their first date at Asties as well, so
Really?
it's kind of fun.
Oh, I
Yeah,
love it.
that's kind of funny. You alluded to this a little bit, but you said that money is a huge part of the book, like making it, losing it, its impact on the character's psyche. Bee's mom went from the riches to rags when they left Russia, and it impacted her personality. She seemed to really only be happy when there was money, when there was something, when there was sort of that
Mhm.
safety there. Yaakov chases it, or Jake chases it and then loses it. What interested you in writing about money and mood, or money and like how it impacts your personality and the way you feel?
Well, I think it started with GameStop, but also very personally, I did not grow up wealthy. I grew up very, like, comfortably upper middle class, but not wealthy. And then I married someone who we both had tons of debt and didn't have a lot of money. And then he started working in the hedge fund world, and all of a sudden I live a very different life. And I think
Mhm.
that I have a lot of guilt around having wealth. I have a lot of conflicted feelings. And
Mhm.
I live in Greenwich, Connecticut, which is like the
Right,
0.01%, and I was
right.
totally a fish out of water when I got here 15 years ago. And so I think that for me, I'm very analytical about the world, and I've always thought about what money signifies and what it doesn't signify, and assumptions that are made and assumptions that are that are false and that aren't. And I mean, even when I was young and I was looking for a summer job, my dad said, "You don't have to get a summer job, it's fine." And I said, "But I need to get a summer job because I need to get experience working." And those kinds of things, that we all have our place in the world, and money is such a big part of that, but it's also not all of who we are. So I
Mhm.
love that. I just like that idea. I don't love it. I don't think that the level of income inequality in our country is a great thing,
Yeah.
and there's lots of problems. But I also think, as an intellectual exercise, to look at how different people respond to money is fascinating. And I didn't know, as when I was getting into it, that the 20s and the market in the 20s is such a great time to do that. Because,
Right.
like I said, you could make a fortune in 6 months. And, it just was one of those boom times. And so and so with Jake, I really explore that, because he makes it and he loses it, he makes it and he loses
Yeah.
it. And
And
I
he
did
doesn't think anything
mention,
of it, even when he,
right,
I mean, it's not that he doesn't think anything of it, but he, like, B bails him out.
right,
And then even after she bails him out, he's kind of like, oh, I don't need you anymore. Like, he kind of
right,
gaslights her when she starts saying
yes,
that the market, right, he doesn't trust it, which I think was
yes.
interesting,
Yes.
that whole
And
thing
I
there.
didn't mention, when I did my little, the pictures, because I don't have pictures of it, but you mentioned the Julian Petroleum oil scandal
Yeah.
over out west. And
Right.
I loved putting that in. There was also, I don't know if you're aware of this, but in Florida, there was a huge real estate bubble in the 20s that burst before the market crashed,
Mm.
because of a series of hurricanes, but also because it was a real estate bubble. So it was literally, and I originally, Jake was going to go to Florida and get caught up in the real estate bubble there. But
Okay.
there's so much to that bubble that my editor and I both decided I should put that aside and maybe write a different book about Florida. And so I was looking around for other things of the time, and this Julian Petroleum oil scandal was like a full-on Ponzi scheme that happened out in Hollywood. And it was, they were selling shares of fake oil wells, and just they kept selling to pay people. It was Madoff. I mean, it was incredible. So I
I
decided to.
can't remember. Was that before? Did that was the Ponzi scheme before that, or well, like was that like the original Ponzi scheme, or was that the
No,
Ponzi scheme
Charles
happened
Ponzi
before
was
that?
before that, but like
Was before that,
I
yeah.
think almost concurrent. Like I think that was an era. Another thread of what was going on then was that it was an era when people were people would buy anything that they thought would make them more money, and it seemed like everything would make you more money. Like
Right. Well, it seemed like that. It seemed like even though the women weren't on Wall Street, even in those circles, everybody was talking about the stock market and what they were doing with the stock market. And I thought that was interesting. Like there was that whole the women's department, right?
yes.
Was that based on truth? Was there a women's
Yes.
department?
So I can pivot for a second and talk about, yes, was it so Dottie asked, was it unusual for women to be stockbrokers? Did any exist? And I have another little presentation I can pull up about like the real first women on Wall Street, because B is invented, whatever my marketing
Yeah.
materials say. My marketing materials did a very good job of saying inspired by a true story, but the true story is Livermore, not that there was a woman on Wall Street.
Yeah.
So that was not me. I would not have done that.
You went
I
after that,
fought it.
right?
I fought it.
False news. False
A
advertising.
little bit of fake news. What I learned, so I went into this really naively because I thought, like as I said, I thought because this was such a time of opportunity, that it would also be a time of opportunity for women. Like flappers were not wearing bras, and they were smoking, and they were
Yeah.
drinking, and they didn't have husbands, and they were having sex, and the Ziegfeld
Right.
Follies, and there was this whole world. And so I sort of thought women could be like put on a suit and work in business.
Yeah.
And that was not the case on Wall Street. The one exception was that the banks did win. There were a lot of women who had money they wanted to invest. There were a lot of wealthy women, mostly established, like Mayflower families, Seven Sisters
Sure.
schools, who who had allowances that they were investing because the stock market was very popular at the time. So these ladies' departments were created, women's departments at the big banks, but they were manned by women who had mostly been big clients of the banks before, or women who were married to wealthy men who had, like one of the women who actually appears in my book, Maryvale Andress, she was like a big she worked in the red, like doing fundraising for the American Red Cross during World War One
Okay.
in Europe, and was a big client of the bank. And then over time, the bank hired her to help them open a branch, I think, in London. And then they brought her over to oversee a women's department. And so that there was this world where women were doing banking, but it was rich, connected society women
Sure.
serving rich, connected society women. And
Right.
that's what it was about. So it was, and there was another world of it, but this was completely different, where there were women who were buying stocks and selling stocks. So could be considered stockbrokers, but they were more like door-to-door salespeople. So they'd go out to the suburbs or in more rural areas, and like they might have a vacuum cleaner, or they might have shares of a company. That was the kind
That's
of
so funny.
stockbroker that you could be as a woman at that time. So
And did that change after the crash? Did they get rid of those women's departments? Because I don't think they have women's departments now. Although
that's
there
a
is a
great
target to reach out to women and try
That
to
is
like.
a great question that no one has asked me, and I actually don't know the answer. I don't know.
Okay.
I mean,
Yeah,
they
because
went away at some point. I think that, but the amazing thing about women in banking is the first time women were allowed to have their own credit was the 1970s.
right, which is so
And
interesting. But they could have their own stock, but not their own credit.
correct. So there was a wave of creating banks for women that happened in like in the 70s, but I don't know what happened to the ladies' departments. Like my guess is it's like a lot of things that kind of got washed away
Yeah.
after World War II, that there might have been during World War II, but I think everyone was focused on the war effort and coming out of the
Right.
Depression. So I think the Depression changed a lot in terms of investing. A lot of rich people lost a lot of
Yeah,
money.
that's
And
true.
then
Yeah,
probably coming out of the war, they didn't need them anymore. That would be
they
my
didn't.
guess. Yeah.
Yeah, interesting.
But I don't know.
There's
That's just conjecture.
Yeah, I was just because I was that fascinated me, this whole women's department, especially because now banks try to target women, but it's more as a marketing as a target audience, right?
Right.
In terms of doing that, but not as like a whole women's department.
Yeah.
There's also a lot of conflicts in the book that don't have to do with money, but do. I mean, sort of like, there's sort of it's independence versus family, money versus family, love versus family, kind of everything versus family,
Family.
love
Yeah.
versus female
Definitely a book
independence.
about family.
Right. It's a lot about like how do you carve out your own independence? But the irony is that even as Bee's trying to carve out her own independence, she's still so tied to Jake that she almost loses her potential family with Nate because she can't kind of separate from that area. And then, Henny speaks these wise words. She says, "You don't have to choose. It's time to reframe what you think of success in reaching your goals." So, what interested you so much about these conflicts that, quite frankly, are so relevant today?
Um, well, I think partially for just that reason, because they are still so relevant. I
Yeah.
mean, I think that I love to explore. My mom is a therapist. I feel like I was raised with psychology as my religion in some ways. And so I come at everything from a little bit of like a relational psychotherapeutic lens. So I love to look at family relationships, and the more complex they can be, the better. Um, you okay? Yes. Choking.
We had that before, so I had my little candy ready to go, or my little
Yeah,
lozenge ready to go.
yep. I get it. And then also, I think that, one of the themes in the book, it's called The Trade-Off. We could talk about how it got that name, but it's
Yeah.
almost like it came to fit even more after it was named. But it is a theme in the book, and I think it's a theme for women in particular in the world still today, that we can't have it all, and we do have to make choices. And for me, and I think this was, to me, this felt authentic. She was an integral part of her family, whether she liked it or not, and she couldn't shake that even though she wanted to. And
Right.
so that tie, and especially because her brother was a twin, and they have, there's such an interwoven connection for twins, that really was a big piece of what her life would have been. And I think most women at that time who had any can, I mean, even Henny ultimately, without too many spoilers.
Right,
But
exactly. We won't say it, but yeah, because she had to make a choice between her family and her independence as well, right? Because
yes,
well, even just during the 20s, because the whole paradigm of what women could do was shifting. And so everybody who had a mindset of like, oh, women aren't supposed to be out and drinking and carousing and having affairs and doing all of those things, it became a way for them to have to choose, do I want to have this independence if their parents don't just be like, oh, that's great, go ahead,
right,
go at it,
right,
right? So it's
right.
kind of an interesting paradigm of that
Yes, to like
shift.
embrace the modern world, right? Like be a modern girl. It was a big paradox at that time, for sure.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Do you think the tech people have replaced the brokers of yore?
Maybe. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, because I mean, it's sort of similar to kind of that time during the dot-com boom. I mean, that was
Yeah.
a while ago, but even now AI is the next big thing that everyone's kind of jumping onto.
Yeah.
You and I have similar backgrounds in that we both went to a liberal arts college and then got our MBA. So, and you've also had, very varied careers. So, how do
Hmm.
you think your background has made you a better writer?
I think that what one of my skills that, and it works really well for historical fiction, although I think I'm going to be branching beyond historical fiction. I'm trying to branch beyond historical fiction for
Mhm.
some of my writing. Um, but is that I can take a lot of like little information and see a big picture and put it into a context that is digestible. And so like when in my original bio, I said I spent most of my career telling stories to senior executives because that was what I did. I did ratings analysis and I would go in front of the head of Viacom and talk about how all of the channels under the part of the business that I was overseeing were performing and what the audience liked and what they didn't. And that came from looking at reams of data. And I think with historical fiction, you do the same thing. You have to cull through so much to get to that place where you can give something to the reader that feels like just enough. With this book, it was hard because I needed to understand short selling. I needed to understand the market dynamics that led to the crash. And I really didn't think that part was interesting at all. So I had to it was like taking a class. And then,
Right.
I felt that I needed to know enough to be able to give the reader a simplified overview that made them feel like they understood what was going on without feeling bored by it. And, but I think that comes from my orientation towards the world and many different jobs that I've had, which are about sort of distilling complex concepts down into something digestible.
Right. Which is
So
a huge skill. The liberal
yeah.
arts degree. I'll
Yeah,
do a little plug for liberal arts
exactly.
education.
That's a liberal arts degree. Take all these things and turn it
That's
into
right.
something.
Exactly.
There's still value
Exactly.
there.
Yes, absolutely. You just don't realize it at the time, right? So have you shorted any stocks since you did all of this
I
research? Have you
don't do
learned about it?
any investing at all. I do.
No
I
investing at all. Yeah.
still no. I fundamentally, and I hate to say this because it's my husband is a hedge fund guy, and he believes that there's what they call information asymmetry, which enables you to invest and make money. There's two theories of the market, which you went to business school, so you know this, right? That
Yeah.
the market is fundamentally rational, and prices will resolve to where they should be. But investors believe there has to be some insight, not insight illegally, but that they can do their own analyses to get
Yeah.
an edge of some sort to make money. I still fall more in the random walk on Wall Street belief about the market which basically says that if you give a monkey a set of darts and have them throw them at the dartboard, that monkey is less likely to pick the right stocks on the dartboard as an investor is. So I don't really get involved in the market.
I guess you and your husband probably have some interesting arguments. Yeah. So your first book, you talked about obviously Lobotomist's Wife was in that kind of the early stages of really I guess medicine gone awry. And then this is kind of a similar one, historical fiction, but it has a very different feel to it. Was it
Yes.
harder or easier to write? Like which book was harder or easier to write?
Lobotomist's Wife was my first book. So, it wasn't the first book that I started. I started a contemporary novel first in a writing class, and then that contemporary novel dovetailed. I think we talked about this a couple of years ago with my idea with the story about lobotomy. I was learning how to compose a novel with the first book, and I think with the second, I knew some of how to do that a little bit better the second time around. That said, this book, just from a business perspective, I sold on proposal in the first few chapters, and once I did, I had 5 months to write the first draft.
Wow.
And so in those ways, it was much harder. Like the process was harder because it wasn't on my own timeline. It was crazy cranking work with two teenagers, or at the time,
Right.
preteen and a just teen.
But do you think that made you in some ways a better writer because you had to you had to
I
reach that deadline, or did it stress you out?
Both. I love the editing part of the writing process. Like the first draft is sort of torturous for me. I love it, but I hate it. But the
Yeah.
editing, again, I like to take a puzzle apart and put it back together. But I had to do that in 6 weeks for the trade-off, which was really two bouts where it was 6 weeks, months and months after I finished the draft. So I had these big breaks. I do think, yes, I think the writing is probably better in that, although a lot of people disagree with me. A lot of people have said they thought The Lobotomist's Wife was much better than The Trade-Off.
I know they were both great.
Thank you. But I learned things from The Lobotomist's Wife about the way to set a scene, showing versus telling. And then I think the biggest difference for me between The Lobotomist's Wife and The Trade-Off is in The Lobotomist's Wife, there's not a lot of extra characters. There's not a lot of friends. There's not like a cast of characters, really. And in The Trade-Off, I really wanted to have that. I wanted there to be more fun and games. I wanted to feel the exuberance of the 20s and also this like it was important to me for some reason. I think because I found it so much in my author life with other female author friends to really have that sisterhood feeling of a bunch of young women who were supporting each other, who came from such different places and such different perspectives. And so I got to write more people. And I think all of that was like makes it a more interesting book in some ways. I mean, if you like that kind of thing.
Yeah, well, it was nice to see, like you said, people coming from different walks of life and coming together. It was very,
Yes.
very collegial, everybody from a different background and having, different points of view. What would you say in terms of your writing process? You said that you like the editing part. So what were some of the things that you changed after you wrote the first draft to coming into the
Oh
final?
my God, so much. So there was one aspect of the book that I really struggled with. And the first of all, B is a twin because my initial idea was that she was going to do a Yentl and dress up like her twin brother
Oh,
and
okay.
go work on Wall Street herself as a man. And then I decided, I don't like that. Um, so that was the first big thing I had to get rid of. And then so much of the beginning half of the book was about was contingent on this deception that
Hmm.
she was perpetrating, and that was really hard for me to get right. It took a lot of passes and thinking to say, does this make sense? Why would she be lying here? Like I really had to drill in on her relationship with Jake and her relationship with Nate to get to a place where I could understand and believe. Like I didn't believe it in the first bunch of drafts, I think. That's probably before I ever handed anything in. But then I went back and then it was too long. And so of course you have to like cut scenes and find where to cut scenes. And then you have to have, I oftentimes what my yes, I can do that, Karen. And I can also talk about my writing process. Um, so so for me, I like though in the editing stepping back and saying what is superfluous, what have I done that I don't need to do, and like there's a whole chapter where the two generations of women go to Elizabeth Arden Day Spa, and I lost several days researching all the details about what it would have been like in Elizabeth Arden
Right.
at that time, and wrote the whole chapter and edited the chapter and then decided the chapter was unnecessary and I could accomplish what the chapter accomplished in 4 sentences. And I think actually if you drill down on the thing I learned from book 1 to book 2 is in every moment of my writing, I step back and I think any like a good writer, a writer that's going to write a compelling story does this and say,
Yeah.
what purpose does this serve? Why are these words on the page? Because it's not enough to just like see the people show your characters having
Right.
fun. Like it has to move the story. And how
Of
does it move
course.
the story? And how does it reveal something about the character? And so I get to those questions quicker than I used to because you can get very lost in all the little details. So
Yeah, no, that's very true. Yeah.
um,
Well, do you want, I mean, you talked a little bit about your writing process. Is there more that you want
Yeah,
to
so
expand?
they talk about I'm sure you've heard of the archetypes of the plotter and the pantser. So the
Yep.
plotter is somebody who makes outlines and the pantser just sits down and lets whatever happens
Mhm.
happen. I'm definitely a plotter. Typically thus far, and I think that you do this even if it's not historical fiction, in some way, shape, or form, I need to do research and reading and pause and think, and I tend to do like character sketches
Mhm.
where I write out, I answer all these questions about who the character is and what's their greatest motivation and what was their childhood like, and do a scene back that made them believe what they believe now, and all that kind of work I do first, and then I even if I haven't written the outline down, I have an outline in my head. I know where the story's going. I know the sort of the key things that I want to have happen.
Sure.
And then I start writing. And with the historical fiction books, I will, the first book, and this is another thing I learned, felt like I had to have all the research buttoned up before I could write anything. And in the second book, I was like, I know that I can just put a pin there. I can just put a square bracket that says, research a place they might want to go out to dinner and go back
Right.
later, because it's not important in the moment when you're writing the flow of the characters and the dialogue to know that they're at Astes, right?
Right.
So I sort of, that's my process. So I go in kind of knowing what the chapter is going to be, what the scene is going to be. Um, and then I go back after, I'll write a chunk and then I'll go back and read it and do a first edit. But I try not to do that all the time because you can make yourself crazy, and you can also
You don't get, yeah, you don't finish
not
the
get
book,
anywhere,
right?
right?
Yeah.
I tend to write when my kids are at school. If I had my druthers and I didn't have school age kids that I was still driving to school, I would probably get up, exercise, and start writing by 8:30 or 9 a.m. But because I have to have my kids in the morning, I tend to write more like 11 to 1 or 2.
Right.
I'm terrible at night. I cannot write at night unless I actually have a deadline that I have to.
Right.
And so that's kind of how I do it. And then I have a group of friends, like many authors do, who I will, when I get to a place where I have something that I think is good, enough to be seen by other people, I'll send it to them and get their feedback and then go from there. So
Got it.
does that answer the question?
Yeah, absolutely.
Um,
And Jewish financial world at that time.
yes. So some of this, I only know so much, and I know that the rules were so different for women than they were for men. So a couple things about being Jewish in the financial world. You could be a Jewish guy, I think, and work as a broker. That was fine.
Yeah.
There were lots of them. And some of the biggest banks were Jewish. Kuhn Loeb and Company, Goldman Sachs, like those were banks run by Jewish people, but they were men. And so the reason that there wasn't a place for Jewish women in the banking world in that era is because the women who were primarily investing were Mayflower darlings and Seven Sisters School, and the Jewish women didn't have those connections. So
Yeah.
they were going outside of the major banks, if they, like to like an Abe Friedland, if you've read the book,
Yeah.
or to a smaller bank. And there were smaller banks that more catered towards Jews, but the big banks, if you were playing with the big boys, you could be a Jewish man, but you could not be a Jewish woman. So that was
Yeah.
go ahead.
No, I was just going to say that, it's funny because B is so sure of herself throughout the book. She predicts the crash, but she predicts it too soon, right? And then she starts to doubt herself, and then she can't forgive herself for that. But Jake, gets involved in this whole, Ponzi scheme, and he just kind of brushes it off like it's not really that much of a deal, right? So do you
Yes.
think that that's something that women like don't forgive themselves when, I mean, I feel like that's still something that is apparent today, that
Yes.
men just kind
I
of brush
think
it off
that,
and women don't forgive
yes.
themselves.
I think, they always, when I was in corporate America, they would always talk about how, men are paid more than women because men walk in and ask for more money when they ask for a raise. Men walk in and demand a bigger bonus. And women, I think we still spend a lot of time apologizing for ourselves. Even someone like B, who is strong and plucky and confident, in some ways, she's not totally that way. She still has
Yeah.
her vulnerabilities and her insecurities. And so, and the stakes are higher because Jake could kind of fail and remake it, and B didn't have that chance. Like everything was pulling her back to the neighborhood and back to the family, and so she needed to really like get it right and
Right.
and
But it
believe
seems like
that she,
as
yeah,
soon as her mom kind of says to her, she finally sees her, then
yes,
it kind of bolsters her back up. And she
yes,
realizes
I think
that
that's
she's,
right. And I,
yeah.
you know, again, like that, I think that as women, we sometimes need that. We need some outside force that really makes us feel that way and gives us the confidence and the strength. And it's too bad that we can't do what men do. But I think it's harder, and you have to be really, really sure of everything you do. I think
Yeah,
it is
no,
true today, unfortunately.
right, right. So what are you working on next?
I am working on a domestic suspense social satire novel set in Greenwich,
Oh,
contemporary.
okay.
And it's basically a story of like a young family with one child, a toddler, who moves to Greenwich. Um, they are newly extraordinarily wealthy because the husband sold his business. And they kind of seem from the outside they have everything, but she's having all these fertility issues.
Mhm.
And as she starts to go on this fertility journey, some strange things start happening that are very like threatening things and things that feel jealous, and it seems like somebody in her new group of friends is targeting her and trying to undermine her fertility journey, and it comes to a head. It's a little bit like silly thrillery. It's very different than what I've done.
Yeah.
Um, but I just wanted to try something different. I have another book that I was working on while I was waiting for the trade-off to come out
Yep.
that I will do eventually, but my agent basically said, let's try something different. Like you keep writing these like heavy books. Let's see if we can flex a different muscle. So I'm playing with it. It's fun. And she basically said, you live in a place that so many people would want to read about. Like write something set there. So
Right.
I'm trying it. We'll see.
Are you drawing on all the people around you
I mean,
surreptitiously?
I've lived in Greenwich for 15 years. I could write 10 novels based on like the stories of things that have gone on here. The fertility piece, I don't even know how I came to that. I think that's interesting, and I think it's very topical today, and particularly for like 20 and 30 somethings. Like I have a sister-in-law who's in her early 30s and has one kid, and she said all my friends are thinking about doing IVF because half of them have polycystic ovary syndrome, or they don't want to worry about having, they feel like they're starting late and they just want to make sure they're going to get pregnant. And so I think that there is this thing in the younger zeitgeist around
Yeah.
fertility. I thought that would be an interesting thing to explore.
Yeah. So yeah, it's definitely something that impacts relationships and just everything. I mean,
Yeah,
it can kind of take over in terms of
yeah,
when you have those issues. Yeah.
absolutely, absolutely.
Yeah.
So
Very wonderful.
yeah.
So are there any other questions before we close up? I just want to make sure that the audience you can either raise your hand or put it in the chat.
I am going to put my website in the chat if that's okay.
Sure.
Um, I have a newsletter that I send only once a month, and it's new, and I'm gonna send like some bonus content every month. So actually, that Elizabeth Arden chapter will be the extra content that comes next month in February for Galentine's. You get to see the deleted
Oh,
scene,
fun.
the
Yeah.
women at so in case you want that, and from there you can also follow me if you're on social media. You
Yeah.
can find where all my stuff is. And there's also, if you want more information behind the book, I have a whole other section of a presentation that's the women, the real pioneering women on Wall Street. And then I also have one for data nerds that has all of the financial data that I got from my husband that I
Oh,
used
great.
to craft the story. So there's lots of good stuff there, and the lobotomist wife stuff as well.
Awesome. Well,
Yeah.
great. We'll have to check it out. Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for having this conversation. It was so interesting to learn about just all the backstory and the way that you approached it. So really appreciate it. And for all of you who are listening, if you haven't read it, I recommend it. It's a great book. So
Thank
enjoy.
you. Thank you so much. And thank you, everybody. Thank you for reading it if you have, and listening and being here. And Lisa, Karen, Randy, feel better.
All
Take
right.
care.
Take care. And good luck with
Thanks,
everything
guys.
with your kids. All right.
Thank
Take care.
you. Bye bye.
Bye.